On March the 26th, 2001, Vince McMahon opened that evening's Monday Night Raw broadcast to inform the world that he had bought World Championship Wrestling, officially ending the Monday Night Wars. On the same broadcast, WWE CEO intimated that, among several others, former tag team and Intercontinental Champion Jeff Jarrett would not have a job waiting for him. Turns out Vince was a little bit annoyed over the whole holding him up for money at No Mercy 1999 thing. A little over a week later, Extreme Championship Wrestling formally filed for bankruptcy, confirming their demise a couple of months after running their last show. Just like that, WWE was the only major wrestling, sports entertainment company in North America. Though bound to a contract with WCW parent company AOL Time Warner, and with international dates on the horizon, Jeff Jarrett was looking at a wildly different wrestling landscape with far fewer opportunities to make a decent living. No longer able to flip back and forth between the two big promotions, Double J, along with his father, longtime promoter Jerry Jarrett, would create their own alternative instead. TNA, which many thought wouldn't last weeks, let alone months or years, went on to be WWE's main competition, such as it was, for 15 years. There were many ups and downs, triumphs and controversies in that time, and though still around under the guise of Impact Wrestling, TNA left an incredible and an incredibly complicated legacy in the industry. How did TNA manage to get off the ground, despite all of the odds being against it? Only to once thrive before ultimately, after countless near misses, joining numerous other defunct promotions that dared to go up against World Wrestling Entertainment. It's a hell of a tale that really ought to be its own book, or better yet, multi-part documentary. I mean, who can be asked to read, really? And there are lots of moving parts, but I'm here, at the very least, to give you the gist. My name is Ross Tweddle from Cultaholic Wrestling, and this is the rise and fall of TNA. The early years. Jeff Jarrett was the primary driving force behind TNA. That's total non-stop action, not Test and Albert, not even titties and ass. Agreeing that he and his father would both stump up cash in the beginning for a 65-35 split, which would ultimately be diluted over time when other investors came on board. Jeff put in just north of $600,000, while Jerry added a little over $300,000, giving them a budget of close to $1 million. Which of course may sound like a hell of a lot to the likes of you or I, but producing professional wrestling events can be a very costly endeavor indeed. Jeff had used his connections to assemble the key personnel, from backstage staff to the wrestlers themselves. Using a mix of a few established name talents, not under contract elsewhere, such as Ken Shamrock, Scott Hall and Buff Bagwell, as well as young and exciting and importantly cheaper prospects like AJ Styles, Low Key and America's Most Wanted. TNA also tried to bring the likes of the Ultimate Warrior, Bret Hart and Scott Steiner, but to no avail. But the base was there, and some of those involved early on, like Mike Tenay and backstage utility man Bob Ryder, would be around for the long term. With the money and the crew and the name, coined of course by Jeff Jarrett and friend and advisor Vince Russo, but more on him later on, all in place, it was time to put on their first show. But this would not be any show, but a pay-per-view, as would all of TNA's early events. With the prevailing notion that television networks weren't interested in professional wrestling that wasn't WWE at the time, the Jarretts attempted to crack the only other market, presenting their 2-hour shows weekly on Wednesday nights for a lower cost than what Vince McMahon charged for his supercards. It was a bold experiment, and margins would be tighter than a duck's jacksie.
Quack.
Most predicted that, based on the format, a roster lacking in star power, and the number of pay-per-view buys that it would be required just to break even, that total non-stop action wrestling would not be long for the world. Yet they forged ahead, debuting on June the 19th, 2002 at a heavily pampered Van Braun Civic Center in Huntsville, Alabama. Perhaps setting the tone for the topsy-turvy years to follow, the show almost didn't make it to air when Cheeks, a morbidly obese wrestler working on the pre-show match, broke the ring, necessitating some immediate stalling and a reshuffled lineup when they fixed the bloody thing, which mercifully they did. A true variety show, the first TNA pay-per-view had its little bit of everything. From high-flying X-Division action, to little person matches, to the other aspect of TNA, to a major title change as Ken Shamrock beat Malice, formerly WCW's The Wall, to win the vacant NWA heavyweight title. You see, in those early days, TNA was actually NWA TNA, and while not a part of the organization's official governing body, the company did use the NWA heavyweight and tag team titles as part of an agreement between the two sides, before creating their own title belts some years later. For the first few months of its life, TNA presented a sometimes compelling, often utterly bizarre product that failed to hook wrestling fans as the Jarretts had probably hoped it would. Stuff like the Flying Elvises. Desperate to be controversial storylines and appearances by NASCAR superstars, surprisingly, didn't appeal to everyone. Bleeding money and fearing they would be out of business by Christmas, the Jarretts allowed Panda Energy to purchase the controlling interest of the promotion, which by the way was 72%, giving them a lifeline and allowing them to remain operational while suffering heavy losses. The highlights of those early years were seeing budding talents like Styles, AMW, The Amazing Red, and others grow and blossom, while established stars like Jarrett, Raven, D'Lo Brown, and Ron Killings worked on top. And Lex Luger. Cannot forget about old sexy Lexi, can we? The booking and presentation could sometimes leave a lot to be desired, but there was something there, and TNA was nothing if not boring. Eventually realising they would in fact need a TV deal in place, and that the weekly pay-per-view thing would not be sustainable in the long term, TNA began looking for a home on the small screen. In May of 2004, they signed an agreement with Fox Sports Net to produce a weekly, one-hour show called Impact. This would give them an outlet to promote the weekly pay-per-views, though TNA would wisely switch to a monthly format by the end of the year. The Fox Sports Net deal was not exactly a blockbuster one, as it necessitated a change in style aired on a horrible Friday afternoon slot that did not generate a ton of revenue or anything like that. It did, however, see TNA move to their new spiritual home, Soundstage 21 at Universal Studios Orlando, aka the Impact Zone. Not only that, but in a bid to further differentiate themselves from WWE, TNA Wrestling began using a six-sided ring, something that until that point had not really been done in the US. It made them unique, even if the change was polarizing among the wrestlers. The end of 2004 demonstrated how far TNA had come since their earlier days of women dancing in cages, and little people pulling guns on wrestlers, as they discontinued the weekly pay-per-view format, with one last one taking place on September the 8th. On November the 7th, they presented their first ever 3-hour pay-per-view event. Titled Victory Road, it was another electric offering that aimed to show potential new fans a bit of everything. And while stalwarts like Abyss, Monty Brown, Team Canada, and the X Division lads showed that the company had a solid spine, it was the presence of major stars like Jeff Hardy, Kevin Nash, and the debuting Randy Savage, fresh out of hibernation, that really caught the attention of the casuals. They still weren't profitable, but crucially, they had momentum. With their monthly pay-per-views receiving strong reviews, while Impact did what it was supposed to do, and a Brucey bonus, it was an enjoyable effort most weeks. When the one-year contract with Fox Sports Net wasn't renegotiated after expiring, TNA knew they had to find a new home and maintain the momentum they had built up. For the first time, there were serious whispers about this TNA company potentially becoming genuine competition. TNA on spike and gaining momentum. Impact temporarily made its way online, while the pay-per-views continued to deliver. None more so than September 2005's Unbreakable, headlined by AJ Styles winning the X Division title in a triple threat match with champion Christopher Daniels and fellow challenger Samoa Joe. A 5-star battle that had the wrestling world raving and stood as TNA's best match ever. Indeed, it was the X Division that was TNA's true attraction. Their USP similar to WCW's Cruiserweight division of the 90s, while of course the stars of yesteryear hooked in the casual audience. A new TV deal was also reached, with the former home of WWE Raw, Spike TV, beginning to air Impact. On the October 1st, 2005 debut episode, the Dudley Boys, now going by Team 3D, made their TNA debuts. They were not the only former WWE stars to make the move to Orlando, as Rhino had done the same a couple of months prior. The marquee signings kept coming, as Christian Cage signed a month later, followed by Scott Steiner and Sting in the months that followed that. On October 19th, 2006, TNA made arguably their biggest signing ever, when they managed to bag the services of Kurt freaking Angle. The Olympic gold medalist clashed with a certain Samoan submission machine, say that 5 times quickly I dare you, which main evented November 2006 Genesis, generated what was then TNA's biggest buy rate ever, pulling in just over 60,000 buys domestically. The fan base was clearly growing. TNA were running more events outside of their Impact Zone base, and with stuff like action figures on the market and a video game in the pipeline, it appeared that, for all intents and purposes, things were good and would only get better. It would be a shame if something came along and ruined all that though, wouldn't it? Enter Vince Russo. Again. The decline and eventual death of TNA was mostly due to poor management, whether that be the people working in the office, those in the creative team, or TNA president herself, Dixie Carter. You know, the person who had convinced her father, Panda Energy CEO Bob Carter, to throw TNA a rubber dinghy back in late 2002. The decline really started at some point in 2007, and the man who became synonymous with that decline was Vince Russo. The noted car crash TV fanatic was as diverse a figure as any in the industry, but his past work for WWE and WCW kept him in a job and convinced TNA that he was worth the aggravation. Meanwhile, Jim Cornette stalked the halls of Soundstage 21, clutching a massive tennis racket. Russo had been with TNA since the very early days, both as an indies man and also an on-screen character, the latter of which he was admittedly quite good at. He left the group in 2004, only to return 2 years later. His influence on the creative team would manifest itself in a change in product that deviated heavily from what had made TNA so popular in the first place. They still had a talented roster full of hungry performers, ready to steal the show, but the gimmicks, storylines, and match concepts got sillier and sillier and sillier. Stuff like the bloody horrible Last Rites match between Sting and Abyss and the electrified cage match at Lockdown 2007 were, quite clearly, Russo-rific creations. TNA fans showed their frustrations and made their feelings clear by chanting "Fire Russo" whenever something particularly stupid went down, regardless of whether he actually had anything to do with it. His reputation by this point clearly preceded him. Still, there was so much to enjoy about TNA even then. The main event crew consistently delivered the goods. The X Division guys were an awe-inspiring treat. The tag team scene was worth the time. Thank you Beer Money and thank you Motor City Machine Guns. And the Knockouts division, anchored by Awesome Kong and Gail Kim, was bolstered by the Beautiful People and others, and showed WWE's fighting females how it was really done. More ex-WWE stars continue to arrive, from the downright disastrous to the real difference makers. Though he may not have been every fan's cup of tea, Dixie Carter and the rest of the TNA Brain Trust were clearly high on Russo and appointed him the head of creative in the summer of 2009. A couple of months later, his old writing pal Ed Ferrara came on board. So then, of course, you had two of the biggest contributors to the downfall of WCW sailing on a brand new ship. Speaking of the downfall of WCW, two other influential and highly controversial figures from that company's past would also set sails on the Wrestle Vessel, leading to a very new type of TNA that some saw the beginning of the end. Hogan and Bischoff have a go. Not long after Russo and Ferrara secured their positions on the creative team, Dixie Carter announced the impending arrival of Eric Bischoff and Hulk Hogan. Though Eazy-E and the Hulkster had been two of the driving forces behind WCW's mid to late 90s ascent, they were both, at least in their own way, partially responsible for its downfall as well. They also did not like Russo, based of course on their time working with him during the dying days of WCW, which actually resulted in a lawsuit between Vinnie Roo and Mr. Nanny. On the surface, everything appeared to be rosy. And while they were able to work harmoniously behind the scenes, Hogan and Bischoff helped instigate many changes to the TNA product. Out was the six-sided ring, in were more stars who made their names elsewhere, such as Ken Anderson, Val Venus, Orlando Jordan, Ric Flair, and Rob Van Dam. There were plenty of blatant hangers on arriving too, like the Nasty Boys and a returning Scott Hall and Sean Waltman, none of which added anything but a fading name value to a rapidly deteriorating product. Oh, and the less said about Bubba the Love Sponge, the better. Hogan and Bischoff also convinced higher-ups that they needed to compete with Vince McMahon head-on, facilitating Impact's switch from Thursday to Monday nights, directly opposite Monday Night Raw. The first live Monday Night Impact on January the 4th, 2010 was loaded with surprises and star power, but opposite a Raw which featured Bret Hart's proper WWE return and confrontations with McMahon and Shawn Michaels, TNA were trounced in the ratings. Still, Spike TV bosses were convinced, and beginning on March the 8th, Impact went up against Raw live every single week. For 9 weeks, anyway, because the results, they were not pretty. The ratings started acceptable enough, but got a lot worse and then completely fell off, necessitating a move back to Thursday nights before too much damage was done. The new Monday Night Wars, eh? What were they thinking? The decline and death of TNA. Following the whole Monday night fiasco, TNA's fortunes, not Fortune 4 mind you, didn't improve. They were no longer directly trying to compete with WWE, instead being more focused on expanding domestically and internationally, with partnerships with OVW and Japan's Wrestle One, while dipping their toe into the Indian market with Ring Car King. alongside their long-standing working agreement with New Japan Pro Wrestling. Despite all this, the company still wasn't profitable, and the bad news was on the horizon. One by one, many of TNA's expensive acquisitions, as well as their homegrown stars, began to depart for greener pastures as the company struggled both creatively and financially. The AJ Styles, Samoa Joes, Chris Sabins, Kazarians, Bobby Roodes, and James Storms of the world, those who had helped carry the company for years, they gradually began to exit. While Jeff Jarrett's influence greatly diminished to the point where he simply was a performer with no real stroke, despite of course being an investor, and eventually left to form a new league called Global Force Wrestling. Russo had left, as had Bischoff and Hogan, though Russo remained on board in secret as a consultant. A fact that angered execs at Spike TV, who decided they no longer wanted Impact on their schedules. Panda Energy also got tired of taking the burden for the millions of dollars that were being mismanaged or wasted, with Bob Carter telling daughter Dixie that she was cut off and needed to make TNA self-sufficient. Impact moved to Destination America, a new network that simply didn't have the cachet of Spike, but was growing and seemed like a good fit for TNA's flagship. More stars began to leave, however, and interest waned. This wasn't the TNA of old, but an even more unstable, consistently changing company that was clearly in very, very big trouble. New Japan also furiously left TNA in the dust, partially due to the fact that TNA turned hot prospect Kazuchika Okada into Kato from the Green Hornet. Impact then moved to Pop TV, a major downgrade. While at one point in 2016, the company didn't have enough money in the bank to put on their own signature event, Bound for Glory, though it ultimately went ahead anyway. TNA did, to their credit, continue to make stars out of Bully Ray, EC3, Bobby Lashley, Eric Young, and Austin Aries in those lean years. Salvations were provided first by Smashing Pumpkins frontman Billy Corgan, and then, when he wanted out due to sinking a chunk of his own fortune into it and not getting paid back, Anthem Sports and Entertainment stepped in. TNA had perpetually been on the verge of bankruptcy and closure, but seemed to have 9 lives and somehow always came out on the other side. Despite a lack of funds, high-profile departure, and other big hits that they always managed to take in their stride and shake off. Dixie Carter eventually resigned as chairwoman in early 2017, though retained a minority interest in the promotion. It was just a couple of months later that Bruce Pritchard, who temporarily found himself in an executive position there, said that TNA was dead, and that the group, backed by Anthem, would be rebranded as Impact Wrestling. TNA was no more, and truthfully, it hadn't really been TNA for quite some time. How they managed to survive long enough to undergo an ownership change and rebrand itself in itself is a minor miracle. Folks will often be critical of TNA, and usually for a good reason. But it's important to remember that it wasn't all bad, and that the company may have got a lot of stuff wrong, but they did do a lot of things right as well. So what exactly is TNA's legacy? At this point, TNA, or Impact Wrestling, is basically indestructible, and it will probably never die, whatever shape or form it takes in the future. For a company that loads of people were writing off as a one-show wonder before they even had one show, that is quite an accomplishment. It's easy to lol TNA and deride the ineptitude which led to teetering on the brink so often, but TNA was also, at times, very, very good indeed. Giving wrestling fans a genuine alternative at a time when it was sorely needed, it offered a platform for future players and those looking to have a second career in wrestling alike. It put on some blinding matches and created a lot of genuinely compelling storylines. And other television content too. There was plenty of dross, yes, and the company's perilous position would overshadow whatever was going down in the ring, but TNA helped revolutionize the business. Matches like Ultimate X, stables like the Main Event Mafia, and a host of other stuff made TNA a promotion to watch and enjoy. Just, don't think too hard about reverse battle royals, Steiner math, or Relic. Did you know, by the way, Relic, it's killer spelled backwards. They never had a hope of usurping Vince McMahon and becoming the #1 wrestling company in the world, and maybe tried too hard to do that on occasion. But when they were just TNA, the exciting, up-and-coming wrestling company with their 6-sided ring and a ton of talent on their books, they were every bit as good, if not better, than the established #1.